Welkom bij dit mini-webinar van het Nederlands-Vlaams Bijbelgenootschap. Mijn naam is Cor Hoogwerf, ik ben specialist Nieuwe Testament bij het Bijbelgenootschap en ik ben hier samen met Dr. Amy Jill Levine. En zij is hoogleraar Nieuwe Testament en Joodse studies aan de Hartford University for Religion and Peace in de Verenigde Staten. En zij is ook een van de redacteuren van het Nieuwe Testament met Joodse toelichtingen samen met Mark Bradler. In het Engels is het Jewish Annotated New Testament. En het is nu vertaald in het Nederlands. Welcome to the Netherlands and welcome to the Bible Society, AG. When people walk into the shop and see this book in the shop, what can they expect? What is the idea of the book?
The New Testament is a book written substantially by Jews, like Paul. It's written about Jews, like Jesus and Mary and James and Peter, and it's also part of Jewish history. But if we get the history wrong, if we don't understand what life was like at the time, if we don't know who the Pharisees were or who the Samaritans were, we're not fully going to be able to appreciate the wisdom in the New Testament. So what this volume does is provide the Jewish context for the entire New Testament, annotations for the Gospels, for the letters of Paul, for the book of Revelation, so that readers can go more deeply into the subject area. And then lots of essays in the back. Who were the Pharisees? What was Jesus' family life like? How did the Romans get into the country? How was the law practiced? What did Jews think about Jesus over time, or the Virgin Mary, or St. Paul? So we have a book that gives us more in-depth information about the New Testament itself. It can prevent anti-Jewish stereotypes from creeping in, because if we get the history wrong, we're going to get Jesus wrong. And it can give both Jews and Christians a sense of, here's what we share in common, and here's where we differ, and here's why.
Okay, and so the target audience is Jews as well as Christians?
Absolutely. And atheists, and Muslims, and Buddhists, because I think everybody ought to read the New Testament, and they ought to read it with a sense of why it took the shape that it did. How did first century Jews understand Jesus? What did they think when they saw him? What were his views on Torah or ritual purity or the temple or sexuality? All of this material is in this text.
And one of the main concerns of this book is avoiding the pitfall of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism. The time of Christmas is approaching now in this time of the year. And when preachers are going to preach about Jesus' birth and the Christmas stories in the Gospels, are there some general things they should avoid when talking about the New Testament as a Jewish book?
I've heard a number of sermons that explain that when the shepherds come to visit Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus, that they were unclean and people would avoid them. Well, this is silly. Shepherds were no more and no less unclean than anyone else. Interestingly, they may have been shepherds who were guarding the flocks that were used for the sacrifices in the temple. But to get rid of some of this unfortunate commentary on purity laws, that when Mary appears, that women were not so marginalized and suppressed that she represents some brand new way of being a woman. They're not about to stone her for committing adultery. There's nothing in the New Testament about that regarding Mary. And in fact, they weren't stoning women at the time. We even see that in the story of the Gospel of John, where a woman who is guilty of adultery, the question is, let the one without sin but cast the first stone. But they're not about to throw stones at her. Nobody's carrying stones. They're trying to test Jesus. If we get the history wrong, we're going to have anti-Jewish takeaways. And the Christmas story is such a lovely story, whether the version in Matthew with King Herod the Great and the Magi, or the version in Luke with the census and the stable. Don't let anti-Semitic interpretations infect them. Jesus is the light of the world, according to the Gospel of John. According to the Sermon on the Mount, his followers are the light of the world. But that doesn't mean there's no light elsewhere, and that doesn't mean that everything was just absolutely awful. So the better we can correct historical mistakes, the better we can understand what Jesus is trying to do. In some ways, Jesus reminds me of my mother. When I was little, I would come home from school, and I was a very good student when I was little. And I would get an A or 100. I would get perfect paper. And my mother would say, "Why didn't you get 105? Why didn't you get an A plus?" And I would say, "But that wasn't possible." And my mother's comment was, "This is great. I'm very, very proud of you. You could always do better." And I think that's part of what's going on with this light from Jesus. You're doing fine. You can do better. How much better? Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's the end of the Sermon on the Mount. That's my mother. Jesus looks at us and says, "You're in the image and likeness of God. Take that seriously. Do more. Figure out how that love can be expansive." But you don't have to paint a dark and negative view of Judaism in order to get there.
Yeah, so Jesus is not over against Judaism, but a part of it, and the whole gospel story is celebrating it, actually.
I think so. I think so.
And about the Gospel of Matthew, you said already something about stoning Mary for being pregnant, which is nonsense, of course. But in the second chapter of Matthew, you have the scribes who are in Jerusalem and saying, well, we have a prophecy about Bethlehem. And one thing preachers may often say, I have heard it sometimes, is, well, the scribes, they knew it, but they didn't go themselves to Bethlehem. So they were kind of, well, the people who knew it but didn't do it, and that's wrong. And that kind of reflects on Judaism, but what is the role of the scribes in that story, in your opinion?
Well, the scribes here are on the payroll for King Herod the Great. And Matthew, who is a brilliant writer, keeps referring to Herod as King Herod, because Matthew wants to set up the distinction between King Herod, who was the nominal ruler in Judea at the time, and this baby whom the Magi refer to as the King of the Jews. I actually find it funny when the Magi say to King Herod, "Where's the King of the Jews?" And Herod's going, "Excuse me, I think that's my title." So the issue is not so much bad Jewish scribes. The issue is problematic political structure. Herod is put in place not by the Jewish people, but by the Roman government. The scribes are in his employ. Herod has been told by the Magi that they've seen this star, and the star has told them that this baby who was king of the Jews would be born. Why would Herod go worship this child, right? Because he thinks he's the king of the Jews. So he says to the Magi, "You go find him, and when you find him, come back and let me know, and then I'll go too." He's not going to go. He just wants to figure out what to deal with the child. And the scribes have no reason to accept the Magi's word. Oh, by the way, for preachers or scientists who are always looking for that star of Bethlehem so you can find it, Matthew says the star stopped over the house where the baby was. If a star stops directly over your house will be incinerated. So what we miss, and this is why history is important, people back then thought of stars as like angels or spirits or the righteous dead who would shine like the stars in heaven. Like they're real beings. And that's how they can serve like a GPS system to get the Magi to Jerusalem and then to Bethlehem and to stop over a house. So let's not confuse science with the story that Matthew wants to tell.
Yeah, and the scribes are part of the power structure. So it is more about power structure, who is the real king, and so on.
And by the way, Matthew, when we get to chapter 13, talks about a scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven, who brings out of his treasure box both what is old, the old traditions that have, which are valuable, and also what is new, which would be the teachings of Jesus. So when we have scribes, we have to worry, what kind of scribe do we have?
Yeah. So we should not generalize and say, well, one scribe stands for every scribe, but there are different scribes, of course.
In fact, it's likely that the author of the Gospel of Matthew would be considered a Jesus-believing scribe.
Yeah, that would make sense, yes. Moving on to Luke, what are their specific points of attention from the perspective of Jewish interpretation?
Right, or what are the bad sermons that we can correct? Still very popular is the comment about the innkeeper who doesn't want Mary and Joseph to be in the inn because they're poor and they don't have enough money. Missing here is the fact that Luke does not have an innkeeper in the story. or the idea that if Mary gives birth in the general room, that everybody will become ritually unclean, so they have to shuffle her off to the stable. But Luke doesn't say that either. Nor, by the way, do you want to have a baby with a bunch of strangers standing around drinking beer. So the reason she gives birth in the stable is because there's no room at the inn to have a baby, right? So it's not an economic concern, and it's not a ritual purity concern. And here's another
practical concern. Yeah.
Here's another place that pastors miss. So Mary gives birth to Jesus, wraps him in baby clothes, and puts him in a manger. She puts him in a feeding trough. And what happens is we miss the symbolism. It's a feeding trough, it's feeding. And when you read through the Gospel of Luke, meal after meal after meal after meal, all the way up to the story on the two on the road to Emmaus who recognized the presence of Jesus in the breaking of bread. So this is Luke right at the beginning saying, to use a bit of language from the Gospel of John, this is the bread of the world. The symbolism is already there in the Christmas story, but we miss it.
Yeah.
The circumcision of John the Baptist, where he is named, the circumcision of Jesus, the offering of the gifts in the temple, which is where we meet Anna and Simeon, which also gets us, here's the temple that's open to men and to women, and there's no gender divide, at least when it comes to Anna and Simeon, or Mary and Joseph and the baby. To recognize how at home Mary and Joseph are in the temple, because it's the Jewish temple and it's their temple, and it's Jewish ritual that they're celebrating. And it's so important because Judea is also occupied by Rome at the time. So they're celebrating their Jewish identity over against Roman colonialism.
Yeah. So yeah, that would put things more in perspective. Yeah. So, and then we have the fourth gospel, Gospel of John, which has not a story about Jesus as a child, but has also a nice prologue. But in that prologue, you see already a focus on the world, on the cosmos, and it's also mentioned that Jesus came to his own, but his people has not recognized him. So that's things get a little bit more edgy there, because it seems like Jesus is not anymore for the Jews, but for the world. Of course, John 1 is often read at Christmas morning. How to avoid playing Jesus out against Judaism.
Yeah. An initial start, which is an easy one, is just to understand how that prologue, the first 14 verses of John, would be heard in a first century Jewish context. First century Jews had various ways of talking about God, because God's name is ineffable, it can't be pronounced. And in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, people would refer to God as the Word. The Aramaic term is Memra. So when John begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, first century Aramaic Jews are going, yeah, that's exactly right. That's not a problem. Stoics referred to the logos, the Word, as the principle on which the world rests. So John is speaking to Jews. He's speaking to Jews with Hellenized education, like Philo of Alexandria, who uses the word, the logos, as the mediator between heaven and earth. It's sort of God, but not quite God. But yes, it is God, but no, it's not. That tension. The entire prologue makes perfect sense in a Jewish context. For the Gospel of John, that does use the word in Greek, Judaios or Judaio, usually translated Jew, about 70 times, it's very, very difficult language. And we see here John struggling with, why did the majority of Jews not accept the proclamation of the messianic status of Jesus? Why didn't they believe that he was God incarnate? Why did they not believe in the resurrection? So it helps to know what Jews might have been thinking at the time. The dominant Jewish view of the messianic age, what happens when the Messiah comes? There's a general resurrection of the dead. Everybody comes back. There's a final judgment. There's peace on earth. There's an end to war and death and disease and poverty. And little kids don't cry at night because they're scared. And the word came to these Jews. The Messianic age has arrived. And the Jews said, where? People are still hungry. And the Romans are still in the land. And war is still happening. Where's the Messianic age? So 2,000 years later, what do? For the Christian who claims that Jesus is Lord and Savior, which is a good thing for Christians to claim, I'm interested in what difference that makes in the life of the individual Christian. If you believe that Jesus is God incarnate, that's Christianity, God taking on human flesh. It's also John 1:14. What difference does it make in your own life? If you believe what Jesus proclaimed about even loving your enemy, about taking up your cross, which means fighting the good fight, even if it puts you at risk, about giving to those who beg from you, do you do it? And maybe that would be a very good way of evangelizing. Years ago, I moved into a convent in Manila in the Philippines. Now, I'm Jewish and I'm married and I have kids, but I move into Roman Catholic convents every once in a while if I get an invitation. And after about 2 weeks, the nuns say, go home. And my husband calls and says, come home. One of the sisters in the convent was active during the Marcos regime in the Philippines. And she would take shorthand notes from some of the trials. And one day, one of the other nuns in the convent was stopped by the police and never came back. So I said to this woman, why did you do that? You were putting your life at risk. And her response was, the love of Christ compels me. And that is the best evangelism that I've ever heard.
Yeah. So it is on the one hand knowledge of the Jewish perspective on in the first century on issues that are mentioned in the Gospel of John, but also our view after 2,000 years, a case of hermeneutics in fact.
Yeah. So the text cannot be restricted to what it would have meant to John's original audience or Matthew's original audience, even if we knew what it meant, because already we're engaging in an historical guess. We as historians can't fully determine what Matthew intended or what John intended, right? The best we can do is guess. But we can do the history, and then not to let it stay there, because the text is sacred scripture to Christians who read it. The individual Christian also has to say, what does this text mean to me in my own situation? How do I understand it from my own personal experience? Or how does the church more broadly understand it? So we put the history in dialogue with the personal. We put the past in dialogue with the present. And in doing so, if we can avoid the ignorance of Judaism, if we can celebrate the Jewish context of these stories, we're in a better position not only to appreciate them historically, but we're in a better position to appreciate how they might impact the relationship between Christians and Jews.
In the preface of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, you say that knowledge leads to insight and leads to understanding, and I think that's a very good point about this book, and I think the Jewish Annotated New Testament really helps to give that insight, and I think especially Christian readers and preachers and teachers should take knowledge of this book to learn from the Jewish perspective on the New Testament.
I hope so. We wrote this book, these 70 Jewish scholars, with enormous respect for the New Testament as a text and historical work, but also with enormous respect and care for Christians who hold it sacred. So we are not taking away any doctrinal concern whatsoever. We're simply trying to enrich it. And the fact is, the only way we could do this in the first place is because Christians recognized the harm that anti-Semitic interpretation had done, and they repented of that harm, and they reached out to us. So because of, and I think grace is the right word here, because of the grace that Christians showed us, we were able to respond with, here's your text as we understand it. It makes it even more profound, even more beautiful, and even more helpful for people who want to figure out how we live a decent life today.